So today we're going to be breaking down another PLUGGNB or new jazz type melody inside of FL Studio. So for the base of this melody, similar to last video, I stacked 3 sounds together, but this time my process was a little different. So I started off with FL keys and made a MIDI that I thought was a little too overcomplicated. So to start off with the chords for that MIDI, like I've mentioned in prior videos, you really want to stick to 7th and 9th chords. For this melody, I did a 3-2-5-2 progression in A minor and tried to stick to all of the 7th and 9th chords that I could. After I had those chords laid out, I wanted to chop it up to add some rhythm to the melody, so I did that by hitting C on the keyboard and then holding shift to get a nice straight cut and just going through and chopping up the chords just to get a nice rhythm to them. The other thing I did to switch up the rhythm a little bit is moving the 2nd and the 4th chords forward about half a cell just to switch up the timing a little bit and overall make it a little bit more interesting. So next I wanted to work on the bass notes, and what's cool about this melody is since the chords are at a little bit of a higher octave, I was able to use 2 octaves worth of bass notes before it started to sound distorted. So as you can see here, we're using C3 and C4 for the bass notes, so I just have a little bit more notes to mess around with. The main thing I wanted to touch on with the bass notes is choosing which chops will get bass notes to make them sound more significant. So as you can see here, obviously I wanted the first note in the progression to have a bass note, make it sound really nice and full and deep, but I didn't really do that with the 2nd or the 3rd. I didn't just find that really important. The notes where I really wanted to add bass notes were right before the chord change, just to make it have a little bit more energy and make it sound a little bit more interesting. So the last part in the MIDI is the top line, and overall this is the most busy and complex part, but really I just went ahead and copied the notes in the chords and put them up an octave. A good example of that would be this section of the top line, which I really think sounds nice, but really what these notes are is just this chord copied over. So I grabbed the first 2 notes, put them up an octave to get that section, and then just skip this note, grab the next 2, moved it over and put it up an octave for that little roll there. So it really fits within the chords and doesn't sound out of place at all. So all the rest of the top line was kind of using that same process of just grabbing notes in the chords, putting it up an octave, and maybe adding some rolls if it sounded right. The only other thing that I did that sounds really crazy is this final little descending roll I did at the end, and I did that by just humming it in my head and clicking in notes as I played it over and over again. So after I had that MIDI all figured out, I went ahead and split it up into 3 separate sounds. So I have a Rhodes playing the basic chords, a one-shot playing the chopped chords with some slide notes, and then a piano playing the top line as well as some bass notes. Splitting it up just makes it sound a little bit more simple and a little bit more interesting since the sounds are all separate. This is a super easy way to use in any type of melodies to get more interesting patterns, and really these 3 sounds could be used as a whole loop by themselves. Since this is a video, I did want to add some extra sounds though, so I started off by adding some flutes. First, I went ahead and grabbed a strawberry flute one-shot from a Mellotron one-shot kit, and then a flute called Yale from one of Shark Boy's one-shot kits. So here's what that ends up sounding like. So then here's the MIDI for the strawberry flute, and overall it's pretty simple. When I was making this, I was sticking to the ghost notes and the piano chords just to make sure everything fit together and almost kind of harmonized. Really, there's not even much variation in this pattern, and I just added this G sharp at the end of every 4 bars just to kind of spice it up just a bit. Really, the key thing in this pattern is making it super simple and using slide notes to make it sound a little bit more interesting. If you want to get slide notes, you can click up here on the piano roll to have a slide note, or you can press S to place a slide note, or you can double click on a note and click the triangle there. So there's a lot of different ways to create a slide note, but they're very useful tools when you're using one-shots. Next is the Yale flute in a super simple MIDI again. This just copies that first roll in the top line, and then I just have that repeating throughout the melody, sped it up here a little bit and put it up an octave just for a little bit of variation. Also, again, I utilize slide notes because it just sounds really good with one-shots, and I've been really liking using them a lot recently. So then moving on to the other 2 sounds that I added that I don't think are really necessary, I started off with Expand 2 on the Exhibition preset, and then the old school Silosin from Omnisphere. So here's what those end up sounding like. So then here's the MIDI for that, and overall it's pretty simple and just reuses the notes within those chords. Really my whole goal for this melody was just to keep reusing those notes to create a bunch of cohesive top lines. The only other thing I added to that pattern was a Fruity Love filter on the PC low pass preset, just to give it a little bit of a gate and make it sound more interesting. Moving on to the MIDI for the old school Silasyn from Omnisphere, this just copies the crazy part of the top line that happens at the end of the pattern. I also threw in these 3 notes here just to make it so it's not only appearing right at the end, but it kind of pops up at the end of each 4 bars. So then moving on to the final 2 sounds of the melody, I wanted to add a bass pattern, so I started off with a bass from Serum called the Realist, then moved over to a Boo Bass, which is a stock acoustic bass plugin within FL Studio. So here's what those sound like together. So starting off with the MIDI from the Serum bass, really there's not much to explain since it just copies the basic bass notes from the chords. Moving on to the Boo Bass MIDI is where things get a little bit more complicated. I really wanted this MIDI to be super busy and interesting. So the whole MIDI actually spans a total of 3 octaves for a bass MIDI. So overall, it just sounds like pretty unique and a lot more interesting than if I would have kept it only in 1 octave. So then finally for the melody, the last thing I did was render everything together. So here's what everything sounds like once it's combined. So yeah, that's going to be pretty much it for the video. Thank you guys for watching. Hopefully you learned something. I tried to switch up the format a little bit this time, so I'm going to see if this works a little better, if it's more engaging, a little bit more interesting, who knows. But yeah, that's going to be pretty much it. Thank you guys for watching. Have a great rest of your day.